Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Bernardo Sáenz Martinez. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. And he is a professor at IPADE. IPADE is the top business school of Mexico. It is a great institution. I have taught there, or rather I have lectured there. They've been kind enough to invite me. And today we'll be discussing, today we'll be making sense of the historic Mexican elections. We've covered European elections, we've covered the Indian elections, and now it's Mexico. So, Bernardo, you had a big election, and we have a left-leaning Jewish lady, the first woman, actually, as president. And this has happened in a Catholic country known for machismo. So paint us a picture as to what this election was all about, and paint us a picture about your new president.
Yes, well, thank you very much for inviting me for this conversation. It's been indeed, as you said, quite a historic event here in Mexico to have the first woman president be elected. And even more surprising to have her elected by such a landslide, right? Almost 60% of voters elected her. And some things that to take into account that maybe would be interesting just to mention regarding what you just said. Her in Mexico, I think her profile, for instance, as being Jewish or from a Jewish family, didn't play too much into the politics of Mexican society, let's say. In practice, she's an atheist or an agnostic. There's a strong Jewish community in Mexico City and some other states, but not very strong, but a consolidated Jewish community. But she's not a practicer of Judaism in any sort of way. And if anything, she's been showing during the campaign, she showed many signs of at least symbolic kind of showing respect for Catholicism, or at least for the Catholic symbols that are important for most of the population here in Mexico. For instance, Virgen of Guadalupe, the Mother Mary of Guadalupe. So her personal profile, it's complicated in that sense. Maybe from an outsider perspective, you'll see, well, she's Jewish. How can she thrive in this Catholic country?
Oh, she's a good politician.
Yeah, exactly. And so she used these symbols. And even this has been discussed even since the foundation of her party, Morena, which means National Regeneration Movement, Morena, Movimiento Regeneración Nacional. That spells the word tanned as being dark-skinned. And that's a word that is often used to describe the Virgin of Guadalupe, the Morena of Guadalupe, la Morenita, because of being as an image of the Virgin Mary that is tanned. So there are many cultural and symbolic things to discuss in that sense, and I think we can talk more about that. But going back to the election itself, as you said, right, first female president in Mexico she will become, but we cannot separate her profile from the current president, from Andrés Manuel López Obrador. That's a key element in her victory.
And please, if we cannot separate her from the previous president, tell us a bit about the outgoing president, because under Mexican law, you cannot stand for re-election. Exactly. Therefore, you have constant change in personnel at the top. And the current or the outgoing president has been mayor of Mexico. He lost in the past, but he has been in power and arguably run a government which has relied on Keynesian economics, massive public spending, and infrastructure building. But I'll let you speak. So paint for our viewers and our listeners
very good points.
More about him. Yeah.
The current president, the outgoing president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, better known as AMLO, it's been a central figure in Mexican politics now for more than a decade. As you said, he was the mayor of Mexico City, and then he tried to be president for 2 elections. He lost, and then finally in 2018 he became the president. And he got this very strong reputation for being close to the people, a very strong narrative of regeneration, of changing, of going against the political elites, against the economic elites, against what he calls the conservatives. And as you said, there's a redistribution agenda, which we can discuss. But a very important thing, as I think, has been the narrative, the strategy of communication. It's quite outstanding in the sense that he I don't know if you know him, he has this press conference called the morning press conference, they call it in Spanish, La Mañanera. Every single day, he talks to the people from starting early in the morning.
I'm aware of it. It's quite impressive, and it seems
so
he's willing to take questions from anyone, which is
yes, he opens up
extraordinary.
the microphone.
Yeah.
But also he controls the agenda. He's in the news every single day. He's one of the most watched streams online in all of the Hispanic American world, like even above video game players and that sort of thing. He's up there because it's streamed on YouTube and in many internet channels.
I think Joe Biden would kill to have that popularity.
Exactly. And he's constantly engaging with people, and that narrative has made him incredibly close to the people, incredibly popular, and has allowed him to defend himself. And even though, of course, this has all of the characteristics of a populist strategy, right? He, from the Mañanera, from the morning press conference, he attacks opposers, he attacks the press, he would deny anything wrong going with his government. He would often, and let's say it bluntly, he lies all the time about things that are very easy to check and corroborate. Just during the election, he lied about, I think we had 37 candidates for different elections, or for different in different state level or municipal level elections being killed, 37. And he just said that wasn't true. He said there were only 6 and that these were the least violent elections that we've had in decades. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. He just says whatever he wants. But he's become very close. His style is very close to the people, his way of speaking. And
if I can interject, your description of AMLO makes him sound a bit like Hugo Chavez.
Yes, a lot of people have drawn that connection. Hugo Chavez used to have a show called Aló Presidente, which was not every day, but at least I think once a week or every couple of weeks. And he used to do the same thing. Chavez was even more out there because he used to make like decisions on the spot, right? He would fire the minister of whatever and have everyone clapping at him. This is more of a press conference, maybe less of a show, but the strategy is similar in the sense that they build up this direct connection to the people. And what makes it interesting is that on paper, Claudia Sheinbaum, the elected president, has a very, very different style, right? As we said before, she's a scientist. She studied her doctorate on environmental engineering. She studied in some universities, I think from UCLA or in the United States, while doing her PhD. She's always been involved in social movements and political movements, but she has a much more pragmatic, scientific, data-driven view, right? When she ran for mayor of Mexico City, for instance, even with Morena, her platform was based on innovation, and hope was the main title of her platform, innovation. And she talked about open government and internet. And then you see the transition. When she wants to become a president, of course, loyalty becomes her main value, her main strength. And she becomes, for many analysts, she becomes simply a replica of AMLO. She changed her way of speaking. She changed her proposals, changed her agenda changes for the presidential election. And she becomes just what the people want, which is, or at least what the voters, supporters of the current government want, which is just continuity of AMLO's government. And we can talk about more specific policies later on. So it's interesting how she managed to convince people in both ways, both being more technical than AMLO and maybe less of a populist, but also by being so loyal to the project and to the program that she could convince also the loyalists from López Obrador and AMLO. And that's why we don't know what to expect now. Which Claudia Sheinbaum are we gonna get? What kind of policies is she going to support? We're starting to see now as she becomes the leader of the movement.
So what policies has AMLO followed, and how does he mark a break from the past?
That's a very good question. So AMLO has when he started his tenure as president, his sexennial 6-year term, he made a very controversial decision, which was symbolic of the change, of the rupture with the last regime, which was canceling an airport, a very big, massive project that was being built in Mexico City that was supposed to replace the current Mexico City airport and was supposed to become a hub for all of North America and connecting it to Latin America. It was a project that was already on the way, but he sort of he claims that the building of the airport is corrupt, even though there hasn't been any charges or any evidence showing the corruption in building the airport. And he changes completely. So symbolically, that was important, even though it's not one of his main policies, because it shows the rupture with the previous regime. Even though for many, even within his team, it was not a sound economic decision to cancel the airport. He did it just to show, in many ways, just to show that he was doing something different. And what he's doing is based on what he calls austerity, Republican austerity. So no one can win more than the president. He's slashing off many social programs that he thinks that they're spending too much. He's giving direct social programs that give money directly to the people without intermediaries, and also centralizing the power in the executive, in the figure of the president. So a lot of social spending in terms of direct payments in the social programs, but also no fiscal reform. It's interesting because, and another key aspect is the militarization of public security, right? He created this new constitutional force for public security, which is called the National Guard, the Guardia Nacional, which is supposed to be a civil kind of institution, such as the police, but he's moving it closer to the armed forces, to the military. So it's very controversial because, as you can see, if I tell you these characteristics about him being so focused on austerity in public spending in a way, and also being so focused on the military, and also I didn't tell you anything about a progressive social agenda like abortion or LGBTQ rights. So you might say, how is this government in any way left-leaning, right? He in many ways, he's a conservative. He likes the army. He wants to avoid spending, and he's not into topics, controversial issues such as abortion and LGBTQ rights or euthanasia or any of those topics. It's a very particular kind of left-leaning agenda. He's much more focused on social justice, social equality. That's his main thing.
And what does that mean? What does that social justice and social equality means? Because it means very different things in different countries. What does it mean in Mexico?
In Mexico, at least from the perspective of Morena, of the movement, I think it revolves around the social programs and the narrative. And again, I think the narrative is also very important, right? The symbolic elements. But going to the social program, so they've been very successful at targeting a few social programs, for instance, for elderly citizens, giving direct cash transfers to them, social programs for students, scholarships, direct cash transfers again, and some very successful labor policy as well, I have to say. For instance, they more than doubled the minimum salary. That was a move that was required. Like even the opposition back in not the opposition back then, but the other parties in 2018 were also saying that we had to increase the minimum salary. And López Obrador more than doubled it, and that was also a very popular thing. And they've been successful in the sense that people have more money in their pockets, at least in the lower levels of the socioeconomic pyramid, let's say. They some estimates from Coneval, the institution in Mexico that measures poverty and development programs by the government, says that during this last 6 years, more than 5 people have crossed the line from poverty. Right? 5 million people, sorry, have crossed the line from poverty. Not at the very bottom.
So tell our viewers
Sorry?
the total population of Mexico, because that'll give an idea of the scale of this achievement.
Yes, exactly. That's a lot of people. The total population of Mexico, it's around, I think right now, 130 million of Mexico. Let me just, not Mexico City, population of Mexico. Yes, as I said,
Roughly
127 million, just to be.
So say, let's round it up to 130 million. And so 5 million is almost a 5% figure. That's massive.
Yes. And it's interesting because it depends also on how you measured it, right? Critics of this have said, okay, 5 million have crossed the line of poverty. However, the extreme poverty has slightly increased. And also, if you measure poverty by needs, for example, access to health, the austerity measures by the government have been so tough on the public health services that when you take that into account, you see that more people are lacking those health services that they need. So in terms of the amount of money in their pockets, it's been successful, but the welfare system has deteriorated as well. So it's not as straightforward, but it does tell you that one of the elements of why he has been so popular, right? Macroeconomically, we've been stable. We've not growing. We're not growing at the level that we could or should. We're actually growing way less than we had in previous with previous presidents. However, López Obrador has reduced inequality. That's the fact. If you look at the Gini coefficient, it has reduced as never before in the history of modern Mexico. So reducing inequality.
So some massive successes. We have to grant him that.
Those are some of the big successes related to labor policy. He did some reforms in labor policy, for instance, regarding how do you say that, workers that contract, the contracting workers and freelance kind of contracts, that kind of thing. So trying to include them into more stable labor contracts. Many of those were very successful, including having a strong stability with the peso. As you know, the super peso was good. And the autonomy of the Bank of Mexico has remained. Unlike many other autonomous institutions that have been attacked by the presidents, for instance, the institution that takes care of transparency, the INAI, that has been attacked by the president, thankfully, the Bank of Mexico has remained autonomous and been able to control the peso. So that's been good. So those things, if you want to look at the glass half full, are some of the things that have made him popular and that have kind of explain the strength of the movement up to this point, up to the election of 2024.
So that's interesting. Now, you've told us why he's popular, some of the beneficial policies. Now tell us about the cons of AMLO's policies too, because apart from being populist, apart from that daily news conference, what has not worked?
Well, one of the things that's important regarding, for instance, the social programs is that they're not sustainable in the long run, right? In the 2024 has already been the year with the most with the largest budget deficit, I think, in the history of modern Mexico. And that's going to be a problem, maybe if not for Claudia Sheinbaum, maybe for.
So let me interrupt. On the one hand, you said he's been fiscally responsible to some degree. He said he doesn't want to spend too much, but at the same time, you're saying it's a big deficit. So that you can't be fiscally responsible and have a big deficit.
Yeah, maybe I made the wrong. I used the wrong term. the narrative that he uses is that he's wants to cut off spending in the public sector, as in bureaucrats and social that he believes that are going to be a waste of money. For instance, he cut a lot on universities, research, many institutions, public programs such as the daycare centers for poor families, and changing them for direct cash transfers. So, but at the end,
it's a very clever strategy that politicians around the world are following. Even in India, you have direct transfers. Brazil, of course, popularized it with Bolsa Familia. I think everyone learned from them, from the Brazilians.
Exactly, but it's the most, how to say it, the most neoliberal way of doing social policy, in a way, right? We used to have in Mexico all of these conditional programs that if you wanted to get the help from the government, you had to, I don't know, take your kids to school, or be enrolled in this other thing, or already have a job, or try to, and maybe help we're giving not in direct cash transfers, but in giving you directly the food, or having someone do something for you. But these direct cash transfers are his way of doing many of his ways. I mean, at least in some way, many of his programs rely on the cash transfers.
Got it.
But it's interesting.
Just to interject. So to summarize what you're saying is that he champions himself as frugal on spending, controlling wasteful spending, but he's giving a lot of money away as freebies, direct transfers. And so actually, he's not exactly someone who is not spending. He's actually spending quite high, and the fiscal deficit in Mexico is at a record high.
Exactly. That's what I meant. And it's all, and it goes back again, I think, to the narrative, right? Because he's always pushing this idea of austerity, Republican austerity. He has even gotten to call it that the government has to go not even for Republican austerity, whatever that means, but he has mentioned Franciscan poverty, just to add into the Catholic kind of lexicon that he uses. But that's exactly the point.
I mean, he famously travels economy class on planes.
Yeah, he used to, not anymore, but he used to do that, and he used to move on a very, like a very cheap kind of Volkswagen or Nissan, not on this big Ford Explorer, I don't know, massive cars. But it's just what you were saying, and it relates to
pardon me for interjecting. The Uruguayan president, who was a former guerrilla, he also did something similar, didn't he?
The what? Sorry,
the Uruguayan.
Uruguay. Yes, exactly. That's
forgetting his name. He also did this similar. He did something similar.
Very similar to that strategy. He lived in a little house. He didn't want to live in the formal presidential house in Mexico, by the way. He turned it into a park. He opened it up to the people. The former residential house called Los Pinos, which had huge gardens. He opened it up as a museum and saying, "Look how they used to live." And now he lives in the National Palace where he works, which is actually much more. Has much more luxury than Los Pinos, but anyway, but it as I said, it relates to the narrative in the sense that he's showing that the government must be poor, has to work with limited resources, but all of those cuts that he's making sometimes are pretty much symbolic. Okay, they do not amount to the massive spending that he's doing on social programs. So that's a bit of what I was saying before. The budget deficit that he's inheriting to Claudia Sheinbaum, all of those social programs are not sustainable in the long run, except with a fiscal reform that is not on the agenda at all, which is also interesting, knowing that they claim to be a very left-leaning government, that they have not focused on a progressive fiscal reform. So yeah, that's one of the things that, as you were asking before.
Let me ask you just a very quick follow-up. Generally, if a government spends a lot, whether on unproductive stuff or productive stuff, private investment gets squeezed out of the market because government is sucking up so much spending. Has that happened to Mexico?
Yes, that makes me think, for instance, on the all of the projects of infrastructure that he's been building during this 6 year his 6 year tenure. In some areas, the private sector has been able to collaborate, but it's the strategy that is used once again centralizes the power and the capacity of the government much more than we'd have seen in other presidential tenures. And the strategy has been quite interesting or original, to say so. He's using the armed forces, for instance, to build infrastructure. So the airport that I was talking about earlier on was built mostly and organized and planned by the army. The touristic train that he's building in the south of Mexico, again, built by the army. Even the hotels that are going to be surrounding some of the areas that the train crosses through are built by the army. So yeah, of course, that squeezes the private sector out of the equations in terms of public and private collaboration. And it's replaced by a very, let's say, innovative way of doing things, very executive directed way of doing things, where the army, they don't need the collaboration of the private sector, where the army can move in and do whatever the president says, and also not a very transparent way of doing infrastructure, for instance. But that's the way he's been doing it. I don't want to generalize. There are some other sectors in which the private sector has been able to collaborate better with the government. But in general, you can tell that we're moving from a very liberal strategy or approach to one in which the government has much more or a stronger say in how the private sector enters or does business in Mexico. So that's worrisome.
Now, what do we expect with the new president? What is she going to be doing?
That's one of the things that we've been, as I said, when I was describing Claudia Sheinbaum, you have these two sides of the coin, right? On the one side, people try to put their hopes on her being much more focused on data, not as much on hunches as the current president, let's say, having a much more technical team, being much more open to dialogue with the opposition. And on the other side, you have her profile of being extremely loyal to the movement. And that makes sense just because the president, Andres Manuel, is so popular and is such a strong figure in the movement that it would just make sense for her to capitalize on that political capital, okay? So what do we see right now, as in her first couple of weeks after being the virtual president, the president-elect? One of the things that no one was expecting in this election was everyone was expecting her to win, but no one was expecting her to win with a super majority in the Congress, and almost by one or two senators, a super majority in the Senate. And that changed the rules of the game, okay? Because
so very quickly explain to our viewers and listeners the Mexican political system, because of course in Britain you have the parliamentary system, the first past the post system. In Germany you have proportional representation. Israel as well. India follows Britain because as a former colony, it follows the first past the post parliamentary system. The US system is presidential elections as well as the congressional elections, and the lower house, they are up for election every 2 years, but every 4 years that they happen simultaneously. And you need to control the House of Representatives in the US to control purse strings. We've seen this enormous tension over the Ukraine and Israel aid bill. And so what is the Mexican system like compared to all of these?
Yeah, exactly. In the Mexican system, we are a presidential system. So the executive gets elected independently of the legislature, but we have elections at the same time. First,
so very much like the US in that sense, that the executive and the legislature's division of separation of powers.
Exactly.
Principle.
And then we have a midterm election halfway through the presidential term for the legislative. And then
does the legislature have 3-year terms then?
Yes.
Because if the president has 6-year terms, does it mean that they have 3-year terms?
Yes, they'll change in the midterm election. What's interesting here is that the President López Obrador had by the last year, I tried to get through some constitutional reforms, but because he didn't have the majority of 2/3 of the Congress, he couldn't get them through. And I'll get to those because those are very important. That's the topic of right now is being discussed the most. But
you need 2/3 both in the lower house and in the upper house. You need both in the house. What is the lower house called and what is the upper house called?
The lower house is called the Congress of Deputies, Congreso de los Diputados, and the higher house is the Senate, el Senado.
Got it. Thank you, sir.
So it's similar, in many ways, it's similar to the US system in terms of being a classic presidential system. One of the differences that we have is the way that the Congress men and women are elected. 1%, some of them, most of them are elected by first past the post, direct representation in the elections, but there are also a percentage that is elected through lists of proportional representation. So those lists are important. I'll mention why, because they ensure that the minority has a more fair, let's say, representation based on the total of the votes of the country. But yeah, long story short, many were expecting, of course, Claudia Sheinbaum to win the presidency, but not many were expecting Morena to have such a strong majority. And that is important because that allows Morena to pass these constitutional reforms that I was talking about, that for many are quite dangerous in terms of democratic erosion, and democratic backlash in the country. So just to mention a few, and maybe the most relevant would be a complete overhaul of the judiciary system. This is what the president has called the Plan C, the C plan, because he tried it twice, didn't go through, so now he's in the C plan. But with this supermajority, he would be allowed to pass a reform that pretty much wipes out the whole judiciary system and then re-elects judges and magistrates at every single level, from the Supreme Court to even state judges, through popular vote. That's the plan.
So interesting, this is making the rounds in the international press in Washington DC, where I sit right now in the National Press Club. I've been speaking to many people from Latin America about this, and this worries a lot of people here. So I'd love to hear more. And this reminds me of Bibi Netanyahu, who pushed through judicial reforms in Israel, very controversially, despite popular protests, and he just rammed it down the parliament's throat.
Exactly. That's what we're seeing. And it's interesting also, as you said, this is making the routes, and also for investors, right? The moment they said that they were going to push forward with this reform, you could see the peso falling and investors going crazy. So you have those checks and balances from the economy, from the private sector, that they have to deal with. Right now, Claudia Sheinbaum is dealing with those backlashes.
I remember the day she won, the Financial Times headline was, and I still get the paper version, was that stocks tumble, economy in tailspin. So the reaction was immediate, and it was all across the international press.
Yes, and this is where people don't know how to analyze, well, let's say, Sheinbaum's style, right, or her actual agenda. For example, a very popular newspaper in all of his Spain mostly, but also in Latin America, El País, tries to spin this view of her having no margin of negotiation, saying she's not a populist, she's not a dictator, she doesn't want this to happen, but she got the majority, and Obrador was pushing it, and everyone was pushing for this takeover of the judicial branch of the government. So now she has nowhere to go, as kind of portraying her.
So that is the El País view, that she is trapped by her own supermajority and by her own followers.
Yes, a little bit, like saying this was what you promised, now you have to do it. And they used to spin this view as saying she's not going to get the supermajority, so she doesn't care if she promises a complete overhaul of the. I don't know if I trust that approach. There's of course a much more critical approach, saying she's just she wants to take over the judicial branch, just like López Obrador wants to take over it. Because of course everyone knows that through popular elections of judges and ministers, the parties are going to have a lot of a say on it. Not only the parties, but in Mexico, remember the economic power, but also cartels and many other groups may have much more power in controlling who's elected as a judge, which is extremely dangerous for our system. And then just to mention some other of the reforms, I mentioned the proportional representation election of at least a percentage of our Congress of Deputies. She wants to abolish that part of the selection process of the deputies. So of course that would make the over-representation of the most voted party even higher. She wants to, right now we have re-election for deputies and re-election for majors, and she wants to stop the re-election altogether for any political position in Mexico. So you have made all of these reforms to the constitution that are being proposed and that can be passed with this supermajority are showing how we're moving back into a hegemonic party state. It's reminding a lot of analysts to the days of the old PRI, where you had a very strong central party that elected its own.
Very quickly, tell our viewers and listeners, especially if they are in Asia or even in Middle East or in Europe, they don't remember PRI. Remember, the youngsters.
I'm so into Mexican politics that I am assuming so much, and I'm very sorry to the listeners.
No, don't be sorry.
I mean, can explain.
It's a great interview, but just explain to them PRI, because of course I'm old, I'm bald. I remember PRI very well.
Yeah, so as you know already, Atul, the PRI.
In fact, I know Vicente Fox. I've met him 2 or 3 times. I mean, he was the first non-PRI president you had.
The first non-PRI president back in the year 2000. So PRI was the main state party and governed Mexico for over 70 years until the democratic transition period of the year 2000, when finally we got a president from a different party. Then PRI came back in 2012, a renewed PRI, much more democratic in a sense, of course. And then, of course, they lost in 2018 to López Obrador. But that's the before the democratic transition of 2018, or maybe the 90s, with the start of this so-called neoliberal period, the party had a lot of power, and it was centralized on the figure of the president. Even though we didn't have re-elections since the Mexican Revolution, whoever was at the presidential figure held all of the power, and it was a very centralized system.
And when was the Mexican Revolution?
The Mexican Revolution was back in 1920. So it's been
over 100 years ago.
Yes.
So imagine you for about 70 plus years, you had a one-party state, centralized decision-making, patronage, quite like many other countries. I mean, India went through the Congress Party, which began as a movement for independence and then turned into a one-party state. And of course, then you had democracy, and you always had democracy, but you had the dismantling of that one-party state. A number of countries have gone through that experience, are going through that experience. South Africa is comparable to the dismantling of PRI, because now the African National Congress is in trouble.
Exactly. It was that kind of the wave of democratization, of the late wave of democratization, and Mexico was an example of. And I don't want to say by any means, I want to make this very clear, that the transition to democracy was perfect in any way. Of course, the governments from PAN, the main opposition historical party, and from Vicente Fox, then Felipe Calderón, and then the government of the PRI with Enrique Peña Nieto from 2000 to all the way to 2018, they had many problems. And one of the main problems was not enough reduction of poverty and the increasing inequality in the country. That's at least what a lot of people point to as the great sin of the transition to democracy. And of course, a lot of corruption. And since Felipe Calderon in 2012, also the increase in violence, right? The war on drugs. So there are so many problems that people were so fed up with the traditional parties. And this is a narrative that all of the examples that you were mentioning also, we could find all of those examples. They have a very, the traditional parties have a very bad press. And that made such a fertile ground for the growth of Morena, for the increasing popularity of López Obrador, and now, of course, for this supermajority. And another aspect that I want to mention before I forget, that we can look into for why did we get such a landslide victory, and why we can say that we're in a new moment in Mexican politics. It's just how weak the opposition is, and how unpopular. A lot of analysts have pointed out, and I agree, that there's a lack of any kind of exciting project coming from the opposition. They don't have a good framing for what they want to do. Most of the framing is too ethereal, too high above for the common voter. Like, let's defend the Supreme Court, let's defend democracy. It doesn't resonate with most Mexicans, it seems. And
I mean, they probably want more cash transfers.
Yes,
more, more goods and services, really.
Yes, and it's interesting because López Obrador has been also very, as I said, very successful on a rhetorical strategy to link the social programs to his own person. And that's also a characteristic that used to happen with PRI, actually, with the regime of PRI. When people talk about the money that comes from government, they think about the money from López Obrador, the help that the president is giving them, as if he was taking it from his own pocket and giving it to them directly. So the narrative of the opposition, and of course the very, very bad press that PAN and PRI, mostly PRI, still have, because the opposing candidate was going through PAN and PRI still, made it very hard for the opposition to gain votes, to gain sympathy, to gain popularity. So that's another aspect, just so weak the opposition is at this point. And how exciting it is for the people to continue the process of transformation that the president has started. How much they buy into this narrative that they need this strong leader, strong central executive to really make the changes that Mexico needs to bring to reduce inequality, but in a way also to take out the mafia of power, as the president calls them, or the corrupt conservatives. So, as same point that I mentioned before, right? The narrative is important.
Yeah, it's an abiding lesson of politics.
Yes. Yes.
Narratives matter, campaigns matter, slogans matter. Yeah, I guess people like Julius Caesar understood that well.
Yes, exactly. But there's still many mysteries about the new government. I also want to emphasize that. Back in 2018, when López Obrador won, I used to say that I was optimistic because it doesn't, like, even if López Obrador had many more populist traits, we knew that the successor would be either Claudia Sheinbaum, who actually became the successor, or this other profile, Marcelo Ebrard, right, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And either of them had a much more technical view, a much more, not as much of a populist kind of profile. So we said, maybe it's going to be a bad 6 years, but even if they win after that, Morena keeps on government, we may have a much more moderate kind of government after that, much more open to dialogue, much more moderate in the kind of policies that they make. However, I have to say that based on what Claudia Sheinbaum is doing right now, for instance, as we said, the judicial reform, the political reform to the Congress, and also some other things, such as what I mentioned about the Guardia Nacional, the National Guard becoming a part of the army, which she recently said that she was going to do. It's harder to be optimistic, right? she's following much more the agenda of radicalization and of eroding democratic institutions. So anyway, let's see. But I don't like being pessimistic, but to be honest, at least in my own opinion, it's looking grim, at least for democratic institutions in Mexico in the future.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. Anything else we should know, or should we leave on a more somber note?
Yes. I don't know. I'm sorry if I was speaking too fast, but of course,
no, you were perfect.
a lot has happened in this
Yeah.
election in Mexico. So I wanted to cover many points, and I hope this is useful for.
This is very useful. One final point: how is this new left different to the old left? Because you've had populism in Latin America for decades.
Yes.
You have Peronism in Argentina, which is its own version. Of course, there has been now a swing back there with Javier Milei, and that's another story. There, the pendulum has swung to the right.
Yep.
So what is new about this new left? And we'll end on that. I think that is the final question I have for you.
It's very interesting. I think with Claudia Sheinbaum, we will start to see a more by the book kind of modern leftist movement in Morena, at least if she manages to grab the power within the party. Because as I said, the current president still has a lot of power. So we might start to see a much more wings into the progressive kind of social agenda of the left. For instance, gay rights, abortion, that kind of thing might be closer, but a much modern, at least in the narrative, a more modern narrative. When Claudia Sheinbaum became the mayor of Mexico City, she went and had interviews with, for instance, Ada Colau in Spain, right? The mayor of Barcelona, and Manuela Carmena, who used to be the mayor of Madrid, people from Podemos, right? So in a way, we could tell that's kind of her personal approach, at least from what I can see, maybe closer to Boric in Chile right now, a modern, younger kind of left. But the key thing is that she has to combine that with the kind of left that Morena built with López Obrador, which, as I said before, is a very strange leftist movement because it's built on total support for the army, which is not a common leftist trait. Austerity, at least in the practices of government, in public, in bureaucratic institutions or within the government, and as I said, López Obrador didn't have this more progressive moral agenda or modern moral agenda. But still, we can expect the leftist movement of Morena to still be in touch or in symphony with the rest of the left-leaning countries in Latin America. For example, strong connections with Petro in Colombia. Support for Cuba, for instance, has been a key thing during this 6-year presidential term, getting them resources, bringing their doctors, for instance, a lot of support for the Cuban dictatorship. So I don't know if that answers your question, because it's a strange mix of kind of left.
How does it determine relations? And sorry for adding this. After saying it was my last question was the final question. How does this determine relations with the US? Because poor Mexico, so close to the US and so far away from God.
Exactly, that's a common saying, and just that's another thing that I think that's another whole topic that we could spend another hour talking about. She has to balance all of those things, and they want to keep very friendly relations with the US as well. So of course, a lot of what Mexico does with Cuba is not very publicized, and the relationship with the US it's the most important foreign relationship that we have, of course, because of our geographical nature of the country, but also, of course, because the economic dependence that we have on the US economy. So it's going to be challenging they have to balance those things. They want to stay on good terms with the US. They'll have to be very strategic on the renegotiation of the TEMEC, sorry, of the in English it's the USMCA free trade agreement. But yeah, in general, I think they'll be careful with that because they know so much depends on the relation with the US. They can't go full radical, full leftist populist movement. And also because of the whole thing regarding nearshoring, right? So Claudia Sheinbaum has already talked with so many business men and women, with so many international institutions. They want to show, even with all of these radical reforms that we talked about, they want to give the impression that it's safe to invest in Mexico, and that doing business across the border is gonna still be safe and good for both countries. So many things to balance. It's ideologically, economically, it's a complex country, as you can see.
Brilliant. Brilliant. At least we are ending on a cheerier note. Mexico may be risky for doing business, but maybe it's not as risky as China. So come invest with us.
Yes, hopefully
nearshoring. We are open for nearshoring. We are open for business. Yes,
we're open for nearshoring. So I don't want to be overly tragical. Of course, the rule of law might take a huge hit with these reforms, but hopefully we're still, I don't know, open for business, and it's not as tough on our commercial relationships. We'll see. There are many questions to be answered, and I'm sorry I'm not able to have a strong opinion on them. But I hope this gives a general panorama of the Mexican election to all of our listeners. And yeah, thank you.
Bernardo, thank you for your time. Real pleasure, real honor to have you on FO Talks today. And those of you who have listened to this, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, and make sure that you tune in to listen to more of Bernardo, who'll be back.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.